She was 20 years old, with £2 sewn into the hem of her grey travelling skirt. She had a character no one would sign, and the deed to a roofless almshouse in a Norfolk village she had never seen. It was when Clara Reed Harcourt stepped down from the carter's wagon at the crossroads above Oakhaven. From that morning forward, Clara understood the life she was to have would be built by her two hands, out of stone, dust, and patience. The wind off the low chalk hills carried a smell of turned earth and cold water. It was late October, the hedges still bright with haws. Thomas the carter, grey-bearded and of few words, lifted her small trunk down. He set it upon the verge with the care he might have shown a lamb. "You'll want the vicarage first," he said, "or the inn." "The widow's house," Clara said, "if you please." He was silent a moment, then clucked to his horse and led the wagon down the lane so she might walk beside it. He did not offer to carry her trunk further, and she did not ask. She took one handle and dragged it after her, and the carter said nothing of it, which was a kindness in its way. The lane gave onto a wider green. Across it stood the church, low and flint-walled, and beside it the vicarage with smoke rising from a chimney. Beyond the church, half hidden by a stand of overgrown yews, Clara saw a long, low building of dark flint and rubble-stone, its thatched roof sunken at one end like the back of an old horse, its windows shuttered or gaping empty, its garden wall broken down and choked with elder and nettles. "That's it," said Thomas. "Widow's house, been shut since afore I was married, and I was married 30 years come Lady Day." She thanked him. He touched his hat and led his horse across the green. Clara stood a while with her trunk at her feet, looking at the ruin that was now, by law and by the yellowing deed, folded inside her bodice, her own. She had bought it out of a Norwich attorney's office 3 days before, for £1.15, being all that remained of 4 years' saved wages, less the coach fare from London and the price of a loaf eaten on the road. The attorney had looked at her twice while she signed, once to be sure she could write, and once to be sure she understood. She had signed in the round. Careful hand Mrs. Turnbull had taught her, and she had understood entirely. She had understood, too, when the housekeeper at the great house in Cavendish Square had come into the servants' hall with the young mistress at her elbow, and said, in a voice made loud on purpose, that Clara Reed Harcourt's box had been searched, and Miss Amelia's silver brooch had been found among her linen, that she was to leave the house at once, that there would be no character and no wages for the quarter. Clara had understood, standing very still with her hands folded before her apron, that the brooch had been put there by the same hand that had unpinned it the evening before, and that no protest of hers would ever be heard above the good name of that house. She had walked out into the October street with her £2 in her hand, and she had not wept, because Mrs. Turnbull had told her long ago that tears in the street were a currency the world spent freely and honoured never. Now she picked up the handle of her trunk and dragged it across the frost-hard grass towards the yews. The gate of the widow's house hung from one hinge. She lifted it aside and set it against the wall. The path beyond was so overgrown with dead nettle and bramble that she could not see the flags beneath, though she felt them under her boots as she went, uneven and cracked. There was an iron latch on the door of the house, red with rust, and a great key which the attorney had given her wrapped in a paper. She fitted the key, it would not turn. She set her shoulder to the door and pushed, and the wood grated on the flagstone within, and she stepped over her own threshold for the first time. Cold met her in the face like water from a well. The air inside was thick with the damp of 30 shut winters, and with the smell of soot and of mice, and of something older that she could not name, which was perhaps only the smell of unremembered lives. A long room ran the length of the house, with a great open hearth at one end and a smaller one at the other, and between them, ranged along both walls, a row of narrow wooden bedsteads, 12 in all, their coverlets long gone, their straw ticks rotted to black meal, their oak posts furred with dust. Above her the roof timbers were black with old smoke, and at the far end she could see, Through a hole in the thatch, a piece of pale grey sky. She stood a long minute in the doorway. She felt her heart draw in on itself as a small animal draws in against the cold, and then she felt it settle again. Because Mrs. Turnbull, when she had lain dying in her narrow room over the mercer's shop in Southwark, had said, "Girl, when a thing is bad, look at it plain. Then take the nearest small piece of it in your two hands and set it right, and go on to the next." The nearest small piece was the doorway itself. Clara set her trunk down inside the door, out of the wind. She untied her bonnet and hung it upon a peg beside the lintel, where some other woman's bonnet had hung before her. She took off her travelling gloves and folded them into her pocket. Then she went out again into the garden and looked about her until she found, half buried in the nettles, a broken besom of birch twigs bound with wire. The wire was rusted but sound. She freed the besom, carried it inside, and began to sweep. She swept the flagstones of the long room from one end to the other, driving before her a grey tide of dust and dead leaves and mouse droppings and bits of thatch that had fallen through the roof. She swept the hearths clear of ash. She swept the sills of the shuttered windows. When the besom fell to pieces in her hand at last, she carried it out to the garden, laid it against the wall, and looked at what she had done. It was very little, a long room, still cold, still ruined, but with clean stone beneath her feet where she stood. She thought, "This will do for tonight." She had bought in Norwich a tin box of lucifers, a stub of tallow candle, a pound of oats, salt, and a paper of tea. No meat, for meat was not for a woman with £2 against a Norfolk winter. In the garden she found a fallen apple tree and a hedge of dry hazel, and gathered kindling until her apron was full. Before service in London she had been a village child in Kent, and she knew how to lay a fire. She laid it in the kitchen hearth, where an iron crane still hung above the grate. The tinder caught at the third lucifer. She fed it slowly until the flame climbed the hazel and steadied, and then she permitted herself to sit upon her trunk and hold out her palms to the first warmth the widow's house had known in 30 years. She slept that night on the flagstones by the fire, wrapped in her travelling cloak and her one wool blanket, her back against the warm stone. She woke twice to feed the fire, and each time slept again with her hand upon the wooden box of needles and thread that lay beside her cheek. The box was of plain deal, dark with use, its lid carved with a 5-petalled flower and the initials E.T. It had been Mrs. Turnbull's, and it was, apart from the deed, and what remained of the £2, all Clara owned in the world. In the morning the wind had dropped, and a thin sun came in through the broken thatch and lay in a pale bar across the floor. Clara rose stiff and cold, boiled a little water in the iron pot she found hanging on the crane, and drank it with a pinch of tea. Then she took stock. The roof was gone at the eastern end over the last 3 bedsteads. She could see the sky through it plainly. The great hearth at that end of the room had a cracked lintel stone, and a chimney choked with a jackdaw's nest of 30 seasons. 6 of the 12 bedsteads were beyond mending, their oak eaten with worm. 6 were sound in their frames, though foul in their ticks. The 2 windows at the kitchen end had their shutters still, and one had a pane of green glass unbroken. The kitchen hearth was whole. There was a well in the yard. Its cover rotted, but its stones sound, and a stone-flagged wash-house leaned to against the north wall, with a copper still set in it, cracked but perhaps to be mended. The garden had been once a proper physic garden with box borders and gravelled paths. She could see the pattern of it under the weeds. She took her small memorandum book and wrote it out in pencil. Thatch, chimney east, bedstead 6, window panes, wash copper, garden. Below it she wrote what remained of the £2 after the carter and the attorney and the coach, 14 shillings and 7 pence, and then put the book away and went out to speak to the village. She went first, as Thomas had counselled, to the vicarage. The Reverend Mr. Hale was a young man, not above 30, in the living only 6 months. He came to the door himself, in his shirt-sleeves, with ink on his fingers, and when Clara said her name and her business, he did not look her over for the marks of a bad character. He looked instead at her hands, which were red with cold and work, and asked her in. She would not sit. She said she had bought the widow's house, that she meant to make it habitable, and that if he could name an honest thatcher and the price of reed, she would be obliged. Mr. Hale heard her out. Then he said quietly that he was glad to hear the house would be lived in again, for it had grieved him since his coming to see it stand empty, that the thatcher was one Joseph Bligh in the next village, an old man but sound. That reed was 3 shillings the bundle at Wroxham Staithe, and that his housekeeper, Mrs. Cobbett, would send down that morning a loaf, a piece of bacon, and a jug of milk, which Clara was on no account to refuse, since it was the custom of the parish, and he would not have her break it on her first day. She said she would accept it as a loan against her first day's work, and repay it in kind. Mr. Hale inclined his head as if this were ordinary between neighbours. As she was leaving, he added, "You will meet sooner or later our parish warden, Mr. Silas Croft. He was not, I believe, in favour of the sale of the widow's house. I say this only that you may not be surprised." Clara thanked him and went out. She met Mr. Croft that afternoon upon the green, returning from the smithy with a length of iron wire. He was a stout man of about 50 in a good broadcloth coat, a heavy silver watch chain across his waistcoat, and a face the colour of cold beef. He stood square in her path. "You will be the young woman from London," he said. He did not lift his hat. "I am Clara Reed Harcourt, sir." "You have bought the widow's house?" "I have, sir." He looked her up and down as a man looks at a horse he does not mean to buy. "You will not last the winter," he said. "It has no roof. It has no fire. You will be back at the vicarage door before Christmas asking for parish relief, and I, as warden, shall have the writing of the order that sends you back to whatever settlement will have you. You would do better to sell the place back to me now for what you gave, and take the coach out of Norwich." Clara stood very still. She had learned in London how to stand still under such a voice. "Thank you, sir. I shall not sell it." He looked at her a moment longer. His mouth moved in something that was not a smile. "As you please. The parish is not obliged to feed obstinacy." He stepped aside and let her pass. She walked back across the green with the wire in her hand, and did not permit her step to hurry. Within her own garden she stood a moment against the flint wall and breathed until her hands were steady. Then she went in and took up the pieces of her besom and began to bind them. In the days that followed, she worked from before it was light until she could no longer see her own hand at arm's length, and then she worked another hour by firelight. The work ran together in her memory like plain sewing, one stitch and then the next, and at the end of the day a hand's breadth of cloth made whole. She swept the long room again and again until the flagstones showed their old colours, the pale grey of Norfolk chalk and the deeper grey of flint chips. She carried the rotten straw ticks out and burned them in a pit she dug with a spade Mr. Hale sent down. The smoke smelled of 30 forgotten winters, and when it was done the long room smelled only of stone and wood smoke. She scrubbed the hearths with sand and rag until the old blacked stone showed clean. She climbed, skirts pinned up, into the great eastern hearth and probed the chimney with a hazel stick until the jackdaw's nest came down upon her head in a rush of twigs and soot. She stood laughing in the dark with her face black as any sweep's, because Mrs. Turnbull had also said that a woman who cannot laugh at her own soot will be a poor housekeeper of her own life. Joseph Bligh the thatcher came on the 3rd day, a small brown old man with hands like tree roots. He would do the eastern end, he said, for £2 and a hot dinner at noon each day. Clara had 12 shillings and 3pence. Joseph chewed his lip, looked at the roof again, and said he would do it for 12 shillings and the dinner and a promise of a good wool blanket for his wife who felt the cold. They shook hands upon it, her small red hand in his brown one, the first bargain she had struck in her own name in her life. While Joseph and his grandson worked on the roof, Clara worked below. She dragged 6 bedsteads out to scrub with lye in the pale sun. She mended the wash copper with tin and solder bought from the smith for 4pence. She glazed the broken kitchen window with oiled paper against the spring. She dug over one square of the physic garden and set in a row of winter cabbages from Mrs. Cobbett, a few onions, a slip of rosemary from the vicarage bush. She cut back the elder and nettle from the garden walls and found beneath, quite whole, an old stone bench where some vanished widow had once sat in the sun. She ate very little, a bowl of oats morning and night, salted, and, when Mrs. Cobbett sent bacon, a broth she shared with Joseph and his grandson at noon. She drank water from her own well. She grew thinner in the face, but not weak. The work of the day carried her into sleep, and sleep carried her back to work, and she felt, for the first time since she had left Kent as a child of 13, that she was in her own life and no one else's. On the 7th day the eastern roof was newly thatched, the reeds still bright yellow against the black of the old, and Joseph and his grandson took their 12 shillings and their dinner and went away. Clara stood in the long room and looked down its length. The hearths were clean, the flagstones were swept, 6 bedsteads stood scrubbed against the walls, their wood lightening under the lie. The wind no longer came in through the sky. It was not yet a house fit for widows, but it was a house. That night, on the stone bench she had uncovered, with the first stars above the church tower, Clara permitted herself a quarter of an hour to think of Mrs. Turnbull. Mrs. Turnbull had been a Southwark seamstress, a widow of the trade who had taken in a Kentish child of 13 when the parish overseer would have sent her to the workhouse, and had taught her to sew a plain seam and a felled seam, to cut a bodice from a measure, to keep a book of receipts and disbursements, to cook a stew for 6 on a shilling, to speak little and to listen much. She had taught with a sharp tongue and short patience. But at the end of every long day she had given her a cup of milk and half a slice of bread and butter, and had once, upon Clara's 15th birthday, put into her hands a small wooden box carved with a 5-petalled flower, filled with needles and thread and a paper of pins, and had said, "This is yours, do not lose it. A woman who has her own needles has her own bread." Mrs. Turnbull had died of a lung fever the January before Clara went into service in Cavendish Square, and had left her nothing but the box. Clara had carried it through 4 years of service, and now to Norfolk, and it sat upon the sill of the kitchen window, where the first firelight caught the carved flower each evening. She rose from the bench and went in and slept, and the next morning she began upon the bedsteads. It was in scrubbing the 3rd of them, on the afternoon of the 9th day, that she found the first of the 2 things that would change the country of her life. The bedstead stood against the north wall, 3rd from the kitchen end. It was heavier than the others, of darker oak, its headboard carved with a plain cross. She had scrubbed it in the garden and was fitting it back against the wall. She must first pull it further out to sweep behind. She set her shoulder to the headboard and pushed. As it moved she heard, quite plainly beneath her boots, a hollow sound in the floor, where before there had been the solid ring of stone. She tapped with her heel. The sound came again from one particular flagstone at the head of the bed. Its edges, when she looked closely, were less worn, and the mortar around it was of a slightly different colour. Clara did not lift the stone at once. She swept the floor as she had meant to sweep it, set the bedstead back, went into the kitchen and drank a cup of water. Then she took the small iron bar Joseph Bligh had left her for prying, and she went back and knelt at the head of the bed. The flagstone came up more easily than she had expected. Beneath was not earth, but a shallow brick-lined void about the size of a large book. In it lay an iron box, of the kind in which parish registers were sometimes kept. Its lock closed, but the key hanging on a leather thong from a nail driven into the brick beside it. Clara looked at the box some time before she touched it. Then she lifted it out. It was heavy for its size, carried it to the kitchen table, took down the key, and fitted it. The lock turned stiffly and the lid opened. Inside were 3 things laid neatly one upon another. Uppermost was a small linen bag tied with red thread, which chinked softly. Below it was a quarto ledger in dark calf. Below that a bundle of papers tied with black tape. On the topmost was written in a fine old hand, "Testament and charge of Nathaniel Harcourt, founder of the Widows' Almshouse at Oakhaven, this day of our Lord 1738. She closed the box gently and sat down upon the barrel that served her for a chair. She sat a long time. Then she opened the box again and untied the red thread. 30 gold sovereigns lay there in the firelight, dull with long keeping but sound, each stamped with the head of a king. She did not touch them for a moment. She thought very clearly of the 14 shillings that had been all her fortune 10 days before, and of the 4 shillings and 11 pence that was her fortune now. She thought of Mr. Croft in his broadcloth coat, and of the sovereigns lying under the bedstead these 25 years or more, while widows had gone hungry in cottages a stone's throw away. Then she gathered the sovereigns back into the linen bag, tied the red thread, and set the bag aside. She took up the book next. It was a ledger, ruled in double columns. Its first entry was dated March 1738, its last November 1799, and every page between was filled by 2 successive hands, one small and clear, the other rounder in the loops. It was the account book of the Widows' Almshouse at Oakhaven, and it recorded on the left the rents of the lands endowed by Nathaniel Harcourt in 1738, 3 farms of good arable and a mill upon the beck at Wroxham, and on the right the disbursements, reed and lime and firewood, the weekly allowance of 2 shillings and a loaf to each of the 12 widows, the matron's salary, the doctor's visits, burials in the churchyard. The last entry in the rounder hand read, November 9, 1799. This day, the almshouse being much decayed, and the widows removed to their kin, the accounts are closed pending repair. J. Croft, Warden. Clara turned back a page and another. In the last 5 years, the rents received had grown steadily larger, as rents will over years of good husbandry, while disbursements had shrunk, and the widows in residence, once 12, had fallen to 9, then 7, then 4, then 2, the marginal note always the same, house unfit, no place for more. She closed the ledger, set it aside, and took up the bundle of papers. The uppermost was the testament of Nathaniel Harcourt, a clerk's copy of the founding deed, sealed with red and signed with a bold black hand. It set forth that the said Nathaniel Harcourt, gentleman of Oakhaven, in memory of his late wife Eleanor, who had died without issue, did settle upon the parish, in perpetuity, 3 farms and 1 mill, the rents whereof were to maintain an almshouse for 12 poor widows chosen by the minister and churchwardens, each widow to have a bed, a fire, 2 shillings, and a loaf weekly, the fabric to be kept in good repair, the said lands upon no pretext to be alienated from this use, and if the almshouse should stand empty, the rents nevertheless to be gathered and held in trust against its restoration, an account rendered yearly to the Bishop of Norwich. Beneath the testament was a short letter in the earlier ledger hand, addressed to my successor in this office, whosoever he shall be, signed by one Edmund Bright, Warden, dated 1774. The writer, being much broken in health, was laying by the ledger and papers of the trust. He had been troubled in his last years by certain irregularities in the mill rent, of which he had spoken to the minister but received no satisfaction, and he charged his successor upon his soul to keep the trust honestly, for the widows of Oakhaven were the poor of Christ, and their bread was not to be eaten by other hands. Beneath the letter lay counterfoils of receipts from 1738 to 1774. In the last 4 years the mill rent counterfoils were short by £5 one year, 8 the next, 11 the next, and from 1780 onward the ledger showed a second warden, one John Croft, Warden, appointed by the vestry this day of our Lord 1780, who had begun the slow work of emptying the house, beds unfit, walls unsound, chimneys decayed, while the rents entered on the opposite page rose year by year, and the disbursements against the fabric shrank to nothing. She closed the box. She set it beneath the kitchen table, and she covered it with a piece of sacking, and she went out into the garden and stood a while looking at the church tower against the evening sky. She understood, standing there, several things at once, as one understands the pattern of an embroidery when the last thread is drawn through. The almshouse had not been closed because it was ruined. It had been ruined because it had been closed. Silas Croft, who had told her upon the green she would not last the winter, was the son or grandson of the J. Croft, whose name stood at the bottom of the last entry, and the lands endowed in 1738, which by the plain words of the testament could never be alienated from the widow's use, had been drawing rent into some Croft pocket these 25 years and more, while the roof fell in above their empty beds. And the box had been hidden beneath the flagstone because Edmund Bright, in 1774, had already suspected what was coming and had laid the evidence in the one place no thief in a hurry would think to look, under the bed of a poor widow. She understood, last of all, that she was now the only person living who knew where the box lay, and that this knowledge was a thing she must carry as carefully as one carries a lit candle through a dark house. She went in, and she barred the door, and she slept that night with the black iron box beneath the plank of her bed, and she did not lift the flagstone again. On the following afternoon, walking back from the smithy with a hinge for the gate, she met Mrs. Elderfield for the first time. Mrs. Elderfield was a very old woman, perhaps 60, who lived alone in the last cottage on the lane. She sat in her doorway in the sun, wrapped in a great shawl, a black cat upon her knee. Clara would have passed with a curtsy. Mrs. Elderfield lifted a hand, and Clara stopped. "You are the girl at the widow's house," said Mrs. Elderfield. "I am, ma'am." The old woman looked at her a long minute with pale blue eyes that had grown watery, but not, Clara thought, dim. Then she said quietly, "The beds remember what was taken." Clara stood still. "I have found what was taken, ma'am." Mrs. Elderfield nodded slowly and stroked the cat once. "My father was Edmund Bright. I was a child in the almshouse. I remember what he put beneath the third bed on the north wall the year I was 8. I have waited a long time, girl, for someone to lift that stone. See that you lift it well." She closed her eyes, as if she had said all she had waited 52 years to say. Clara curtsied, though the old woman could not see her, and went on. In the morning she went about her work as before. She scrubbed, she swept, she dug in the garden, she mended the last of the bedsteads, and she spoke to no one of what she had found. When Mrs. Cobbett came down at noon with a basin of broth, Clara thanked her and said nothing of the box. When she passed Mr. Croft upon the green, and he did not lift his hat, and she did not curtsy, she said nothing of the box. She waited 3 days. She read the ledger from beginning to end by firelight, with the door barred and the shutters drawn. She copied its essential figures into her memorandum book. She counted the sovereigns twice. She made a list of the tenants, and set against each name what she knew of who now held those lands, and paid rent to whom. On the 4th morning she rose early, put on her cleanest cap, and her mended grey gown, wrapped the ledger and papers in clean linen, and walked across the green to the vicarage. Mr. Hale was at his breakfast. He rose when she came in, and would have offered her tea, but she said quietly that what she had brought him was not a matter for the kitchen, and that if he could spare her half an hour in his study she would be much obliged. He looked at her once, and put down his cup, and led her into the study, and closed the door. She laid the linen bundle upon his desk. She did not say much. She said that in the course of clearing her house she had found, beneath a flagstone at the head of one of the beds, a locked box, that in the box were an account book, a testament, a letter, and a sum of 30 sovereigns, that the account book and the testament and the letter, taken together, appeared to her to show that the lands endowed to the almshouse by Nathaniel Harcourt in 1738 had been alienated from their proper use in the last quarter of the last century, and had been drawing rent into private hands ever since, that she had no wish to accuse any person in the parish upon her own authority, being a stranger and a young woman without standing, but that she felt it her duty, as the present owner of the fabric of the almshouse, to put the papers into his hands as the minister of the parish, that he might do with them what he thought right. She untied the linen and laid the ledger and the papers upon his desk. She did not lay the sovereigns there. The sovereigns, she said, she had left in her house, where they had lain these 25 years or more, and where they would remain until such time as it should be determined to whom they properly belonged. Mr. Hale read the letter of Edmund Bright first. Then he read the testament of Nathaniel Halcott. Then he opened the ledger and read some pages of it, and turned to the last entry, and read that and closed the book, and sat a long minute with his hand upon its cover. At last he said, "Miss Harcourt, I must ask you 2 questions. The first is whether you have spoken of this to any other person." "To no one, sir, except that Mrs. Elderfield in the lane spoke to me yesterday of the beds, and of her father Edmund Bright, and of what he laid beneath the 3rd bed on the north wall." Mr. Hale was silent a moment. "Then she has waited a long time," he said. "My second question, are you willing to speak of this, if it should become necessary, before a magistrate and upon oath?" "I am, sir." He nodded slowly. He said that in that case he must ride into Norwich that very day, and lay the papers before an attorney of his acquaintance, one Mr. Purfleet, who was known to him as an honest man and a careful one, and who would know both the law of charitable trusts and the proper form of proceeding. He asked her leave to take the papers with him. She gave it. He asked her also whether she would, in the meantime, keep silent and continue her work at the widow's house, as if nothing had passed between them. She said she would. He rode out that afternoon upon the vicarage cob with the linen bundle in his saddle-bag, and Clara walked back across the green to her house and took up her besom. It was 17 days before the matter came to its end, and in those 17 days Clara did not permit herself to think of it above once a day, at night, when she sat by the kitchen fire with Mrs. Turnbull's needle-box open upon her lap, and mended the linen she had brought from London. She thought of it then only long enough to say, in her mind, that she had done what she had been able to do, and that the rest was in other hands than hers and God's, and then she took up her needle again, and drew her thread, and set the next stitch. Mr. Purfleet came down from Norwich upon the 9th day in a hired gig with Mr. Hale beside him. He was a small dry man with spectacles who bowed to Clara with the gravity he would have shown a duchess. He asked to see the flagstone and the void beneath it, made small notes in a small book, and asked her to repeat exactly how she had come to lift the stone. She told him, and he wrote it down. He drew up an affidavit upon the kitchen table with his own pen, and she signed it in her round, careful hand, and Mr. Hale signed as witness. Mr. Purfleet took the affidavit and the papers back to Norwich. He came again upon the 14th day with a magistrate and a clerk, and they went to Silas Croft's house at the other end of the village. Clara was not present, and did not ask. Upon the 17th day, in the middle of the morning, Mr. Hale came down to the widow's house alone. He found Clara in the garden, setting a row of currant slips against the south wall. He stood by the gate a moment before she saw him. When she saw him, she rose, brushing the earth from her hands. He said, "Miss Harcourt, it is done." She did not ask what was done. She waited. He said that Mr. Croft, shown the ledger, the testament, the letter, and the affidavit, had first denied all knowledge of the papers. That shown his own rent books, produced under warrant, which recorded the receipt by him and by his father of the rents of the 3 farms and the mill, he had denied those rents were ever the property of the trust. That shown Edmund Bright's counterfoils in his own grandfather's hand, he had ceased to speak. Mr. Purfleet had thereupon laid before him a schedule of restitution drawn according to the law of charitable trusts. The 3 farms and the mill, being still by law the property of the trust, would return to it without further process, together with such of Mr. Croft's movable goods as might make good the arrears. And Mr. Croft had signed, before the magistrate, a deed of restitution and a resignation of his office as Parish Warden. He was, Mr. Hale said, a broken man, but he was not a ruined man. He would keep his own house and his own name. He would not be prosecuted, for Mr. Purfleet had judged, and Clara herself had wished when she was asked, that the recovery of the trust was of more account than the punishment of the trustee. Mr. Hale paused. He said, "Miss Harcourt, the trust is restored. The rents will begin to come in at Michaelmas. The bishop has been written to. The almshouse is once more in law what it was in 1738, a house for 12 poor widows of this parish. There remains only the question of its fabric," Clara said. "The fabric is mine, sir. I bought it." "You did," said Mr. Hale. "And the trust cannot take it from you against your will, but the trust can buy it from you at a fair price. Or, if you should be willing, it can appoint you matron of the house, at the salary that was paid to the matron in 1738, which is £15 a year and your board, and you may live in it and keep it, and see it filled again with the widows for whom it was built." Clara was silent a long time. She looked at the currant slips at her feet, and at the low stone wall she had rebuilt with her own hands, and at the smoke rising from her own kitchen chimney. She looked at last at Mr. Hale. She said, "I am 20 years old, sir. I am younger than any matron the parish is likely to appoint." "You are," said Mr. Hale. "You are also the only person in the parish who has, in the last 30 years, opened the door of this house and lit a fire in it. The vestry has met. The vote was unanimous." Clara bent her head. She said, after a while, that she would accept the office, that she would sell the fabric to the trust at the price she had paid for it, and no more, and that she would ask, as one condition, that the 30 sovereigns which had lain in the box be applied, in the first instance, to the mending of the great hearth at the eastern end, and the buying of 12 wool blankets, and the payment of Joseph Bligh's promise. Mr. Hale said the vestry had already voted that this should be so. He went away then, and Clara stood a while in the garden with her hands in her apron pockets and the low winter sun upon her face. The first of the widows came in on the 2nd of December, a Mrs. Larling from a cottage at Ludham, whose son had died at sea. The second came a week after, and the third the week after that. By Christmas Eve there were 7 widows in the widow's house at Oakhaven, and by Candlemas there were 10, and before Lady Day the 12th bed, the third from the kitchen end on the north wall, above the flagstone that had been lifted and set again with fresh mortar, was filled by a Mrs. Thorpe from the village itself, who had been living upon parish relief in a lean-to behind the smithy since her husband's death, and who wept quietly when she saw the clean sheets and the wool blanket folded at the foot of her bed. Mrs. Elderfield did not come to live in the house. She was too old to move, she said, and her cottage suited her well enough. But she came upon fair afternoons, with her black cat under her shawl, and she sat by the kitchen fire, and she spoke sometimes of her father Edmund Bright, and of the beds as they had been in her childhood, and the widows listened, and Clara listened, and the fire burned steady in the grate. On the last night of that first winter, being the eve of Lady Day, Clara stood in the garden of the widow's house after supper, and looked back at it. The wind was cold, but there was no snow. The moon was up beyond the church tower. Every window of the long room was lit with the yellow of oil lamps and the redder yellow of the kitchen fire, and through the kitchen window, which had by then a proper pane of glass in it, she could see the 12 widows sitting in a half-circle about the hearth, some knitting, some mending, one reading aloud from a book in her lap, and she could hear their voices, low and easy, and the small clear sound of needles moving in cloth. Upon the sill of that window, between the glass and the room, where the firelight caught the carved 5-petalled flower and the initials E.T., stood Mrs. Turnbull's needle-box, open, with a paper of pins and a length of white thread laid ready beside it for whichever widow should next have need. Clara stood a long minute in the cold garden. She thought without bitterness and without pride of the housekeeper in Cavendish Square and of Silas Croft upon the green, and she thought longer of Mrs. Turnbull in her narrow room over the mercer's shop, and of Edmund Bright, who had laid a box beneath a flagstone in 1774 and had waited 52 years for someone to lift it, and of Nathaniel Halcott, who had trusted the parish of Oakhaven to keep his word for him. Then she went in and closed the door of the widow's house behind her, and took her place at the fire, and took up her own needle, and set the next stitch. If this story stayed with you, there are more waiting here on the quiet ledger.